The stroller had a stubborn left wheel that pulled slightly to the side, a quirk Amalia had learned to compensate for the way she handled most fractured things, quietly and automatically. The rubber grip bit into her palms as she steered, a steady, grounding friction against her skin. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September, the kind of day Denver does better than almost anywhere else. The sky arched overhead in a deep, unhurried blue, carrying that thin, high-altitude bite reminding everyone the mountains were always watching from the west. Washington Park hummed with just enough life to feel vibrant, sparing her the hassle of navigating an obstacle course. She found a quiet stretch of path along the lake where cottonwood trees dropped their leaves in slow, spiraling arcs, pushing the double stroller at the leisurely pace of a woman with nowhere urgent to be. Technically, a 4 o'clock conference call loomed over her schedule, but a sleeping baby at that hour justified any amount of frantic calendar rearranging. Luca was already halfway to dreamland, his head drooping at the exact angle that signaled an imminent surrender to gravity. Mia, conversely, scrutinized a fallen leaf with the raw intensity of a scholar discovering the concept of yellow for the absolute first time. Her small fist closed over the brittle edges. She looked up at Amalia with those distinct eyes. The very eyes Amalia had fiercely loved and bitterly resented for 17 months, and offered the foliage as a solemn gift. "Thank you," Amalia murmured in her most official, diplomatic register. "That is a very good leaf." Mia grunted in deep satisfaction and instantly crushed it into dust. The dry, papery scent of crushed autumn leaves wafted up, mingling with the faint, sweet smell of baby lotion lingering on Mia's skin. Amalia aimed the stubborn stroller toward the southern path when a violent shift in the atmosphere hit her. Her pulse spiked against the collar of her sweater. A sudden cold prickle crawled up the nape of her neck, bringing a heavy metallic taste to the back of her tongue. Her body recognized the danger long before her brain could catch up, demanding she keep walking and never look up. She looked anyway. He stood roughly 40 feet away on the opposite side of the asphalt, gripping a rolled set of blueprints under one arm and a coffee cup in his other hand. He wore a dark jacket over a gray shirt, his light brown hair overgrown, a newer, close-cropped beard framing his jaw. He had finally grown into his own face. The hollows beneath his cheekbones had settled into sharp, steady lines. He occupied exactly the right amount of space in the world, radiating the quiet gravity of William Hart. He was entirely focused on his phone, buying her exactly 3 seconds to make a decision. She held her ground. A bone-deep exhaustion anchored her sneakers to the pavement. She was utterly drained of the energy required to flee. She was simply done rerouting her life, finished with shrinking herself so his ghost couldn't catch her in unfamiliar cities. Denver belonged to her now. He had surrendered his right to this geography the day he left. He looked up. A pressurized, suffocating silence slammed down over the park. It was the heavy, breathless vacuum of unfinished business, thick enough to drown out the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of the cottonwoods. The entire world vanished for the 2 seconds it took William Hart to comprehend the scene in front of him. His coffee cup tilted, saved only by reflex, but the blueprints slipped from his arm and unspooled across the concrete. He left them there. This renowned architect, a man who engineered sprawling public libraries and pedestrian bridges, someone who built his entire legacy on calculating exactly how much weight a structure could bear, stood utterly paralyzed. He resembled a builder walking into his own masterpiece only to discover the foundation was built on sand. His gaze drifted heavily from Amalia's face to the double stroller. He took in Luca, whose round cheek was now squished against the padded fabric in deep sleep, before his eyes locked onto Mia. She stared back at the tall stranger with unfiltered, innocent curiosity. Mia had green eyes. They were the exact shade of crushed sage, his eyes. Amalia watched the devastating math compute across his features. Amalia's knuckles turned bone white around the stroller handle. Her chest tightened, trapping the crisp autumn air in her lungs. She refused to cross her arms or take a defensive step back. She stood rooted, her dark hair catching the golden afternoon light, her chin held perfectly level. She had spent a year and 5 months bracing for a collision she secretly prayed would never come. rehearsing the blistering anger that would surely be her shield. The fury was certainly there, burning like acid in her throat, but it was instantly eclipsed by the one devastating truth she had never confessed to anyone. A violent, aching warmth flared in her chest. She still loved him. The gap between them spanned 30 feet, 2 long years, and a ragged, unread letter tucked into the back of her nightstand. William took a single, halting step forward before hitting an invisible wall, acutely aware he lacked the clearance to cross it. He looked like a man drowning in an unsolvable equation. Mia, deciding the standoff lacked proper entertainment, gripped the plastic edge of her tray and hauled herself up on wobbly legs. She pointed an authoritative index finger directly at the paralyzed architect. "Bah," she announced with absolute conviction. William's expression shattered. A raw, nameless devastation washed over his face, the visceral shock of a man having his entire reality rewritten in a single breath. His jaw worked, swallowing a word that wouldn't come, the forgotten coffee cup dangling precariously from his fingertips. Amalia met his gaze head-on. Standing in a sterile hospital room at 2 a.m. 17 months ago, holding 2 impossibly small lives, she had sworn an oath to never look away from the hardest parts of life again. And William Hart was the hardest part of all. He took another agonizing step toward her, testing the space between them like fragile ice over a freezing river. The wind swept through the cottonwoods, showering the gap between them in a wave of bruised gold. William opened his mouth and surrendered the only word he had left. Amalia. The letter had been waiting on the kitchen counter since Sunday night, anchored beneath the heavy brass of his spare key. He had scrawled it across the back of a crumpled project invoice, a testament to a man who lived his life in blueprints rather than carefully chosen stationery. She finally discovered it on a Tuesday evening. Returning from a late client dinner, her body carried the pleasant, heavy warmth of 2 glasses of Cabernet. She stepped into the apartment fully expecting the familiar sight of him hunched over his sketchbook on the living room sofa. The leather-bound book lay abandoned on the coffee table. The apartment was entirely hollow. A profound, primitive intuition, a sudden tightening in her gut warning of an unseen cliff edge, forced her hand toward the paper before she could retreat to the bedroom. Amalia, I've been sitting here for 3 hours trying to find a different way to say this, and I can't. So I'm going to say it straight, because you deserve straight. I got the position in Denver. Meridian Group. The infrastructure contract I've been building toward for 6 years. They want me there in 3 weeks. I know what you're going to say. I know because I've been saying it to myself, in your voice for the last 72 hours. You'd say we could figure it out. You'd say long distance is hard, but people do it. You'd say your life is here, your work is here, your family is here. You've always been clear about that, and I've always loved you for knowing exactly where you belong. That's the part I can't get past. You know where you belong, and I've known for a long time that I've been building toward something that wasn't here. I'm leaving because I think if I stay, I'll spend the rest of my life watching myself turn into someone who resents the choice. You deserve someone who is completely here. You deserve more than a man with 1 foot out the door. Please don't come after me. Please don't call. I know myself well enough to know that if you ask me to stay, I will. And then I'll spend years wondering, and that will hollow us out from the inside until there's nothing left. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. I need you to know that, even though I'm proving it very badly right now. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. William. She devoured the ink 4 separate times. The initial read was a frantic blur, a desperate skimming hoping the sheer speed would dilute the impact. On the second pass, the words "please don't come after me" seized her lungs, stealing her oxygen until the edges of the room darkened. By the third reading, she stood paralyzed. The jagged teeth of his spare key bit sharply into her palm, leaving deep crescent moons in her flesh as she squeezed her fist shut. Halfway through the 4th attempt, her knees simply gave out. She collapsed against the baseboards, the cold linoleum seeping through her skirt. The true devastation of an ending like this stems from a ruthless calculation. He had weighed their entire shared history, the mundane weekday mornings, the navigated arguments, the quiet intimacy of his hand tangled in her hair as he slept. and he had mathematically concluded that his ambition was simply heavier. Furthermore, he had made that devastating calculation for her, effectively silencing her before she could even speak. She navigated the ensuing days trapped in a dissociative fog. Her physical body commuted to the office, sat through grueling strategy meetings, and drafted complex contracts. Her voice projected a terrifying hollow professionalism as she approved deadlines and delegated tasks. She refused to shed a single tear, swallowing the thick lump in her throat until it felt like a bruised stone. By Wednesday, she finally surrendered to a clinic appointment she had deferred for a fortnight, dreading the moment a theoretical fear would crystallize into reality. She perched on the edge of the examination table, shivering as the crinkling paper gown provided zero insulation against the sterile, heavily air-conditioned room. She stared blankly at a faded print of a Mediterranean coastline, a pathetic attempt to disguise the clinical dread of the space. The attending nurse delivered the results with a practiced, merciful simplicity. Amalia nodded mechanically, expressed a polite measure of gratitude, and retreated to her car. She remained locked inside the vehicle for 22 agonizing minutes. The reality of the moment offered no poetic shelter. A 29-year-old woman sat entirely alone in a sun-baked parking lot, exactly 6 days after a hastily scrawled invoice decimated her future, clutching a pamphlet confirming her pregnancy. The steering wheel leather grew sticky beneath her damp palms. Her pulse hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against her temples. The letter was already etched into her bone marrow, yet, echoing against the deafening roar of her grief, one specific line played on a relentless loop. "I think if I stay, I'll spend the rest of my life watching myself turn into someone who resents the choice." He possessed such absolute certainty. He had packaged his unilateral decision into a neat envelope, actively demanding she never challenge it. The sheer arrogance of his departure struck her like a physical blow. He had secured his own clean getaway, deliberately revoking her right to look him in the eye and reveal the life quietly multiplying inside her. Her fury manifested as a slow, rising tide. It crept through her veins in that parking lot, followed her into her silent apartment, and steeped with her in a scalding bath. By morning, it had crystallized into a pure, clarifying rage. Over the next 9 days, she drafted 11 different text messages. Her thumbs hovered over the screen, pouring out venom, begging for an explanation or simply typing his name. Her chest would heave with the effort of breathing around the unspoken words, only to furiously delete every single syllable. On the 10th day, she locked her phone. He had claimed the power of choice, operating under the arrogant assumption that he possessed all the variables. She would claim her own power. The sharp chirp of a cardinal suddenly pierced the memory, violently snapping her back to the asphalt path of Washington Park. The golden afternoon light washed over the cottonwoods once more. Luca remained slumped in a heavy slumber. Mia stood upright, her sage-green eyes locked onto the paralyzed architect. The defining truth of their separation anchored Amalia firmly to the concrete. He had stolen her right to choose. This stark, documented fact had calcified in her mind over 17 months, impossible to reshape into anything forgiving. She clamped her hands over the rubber grips of the stroller, her knuckles aching from the sheer force of her hold. William had just spoken her name, his voice ragged, carrying the brutal weight of a man spending his last remaining currency. She let the silence stretch, refusing to offer him an immediate lifeline. The Hartwell estate case had landed squarely on Amalia's desk back in August. A fiercely contested trust, 3 deeply embittered adult siblings, and a sprawling family property in Cherry Creek, valued somewhere north of $4 million. It was exactly the kind of case that looked deceptively clean on an intake form, only revealing its venomous complexity long after the retainer had been signed. She had accepted the challenge. She thrived on complexity. What she had completely failed to anticipate, what had not even registered as a phantom variable in her most paranoid 3 a.m. mental gymnastics, was that the Hartwell family's primary architect of record for the massive estate renovation was William Hart. His firm had secured the lucrative contract 6 months prior, back when the siblings still lived under the delusion that they could agree on anything. She discovered this catastrophic detail on a Friday morning, a mere 20 hours after the collision in Washington Park. Cora called within 3 minutes of receiving the text. "You need to recuse yourself immediately," Cora ordered, not even waiting for Amalia to finish her greeting. "I am absolutely not recusing myself." "Amalia, it is a strictly professional context. We are both functioning adults. I will manage it." A heavy, static-filled pause stretched across the line from Cora's end, pregnant with approximately 47 unspoken, highly critical opinions. How did he look? Amalia stared flatly at the textured ceiling of her Denver hotel room. Old, liar, tired, also a lie. The Hartwell mediation was set for Monday at 2 o'clock sharp in the downtown offices of the estate's accountant. Gerald was a man who radiated the deeply defeated energy of someone who had spent 30 years managing other people's toxic family drama and had completely depleted his patience reserves. The conference room was an aggressively corporate glass box. The air conditioning hummed with a sterile, dry chill that immediately sapped the moisture from Amalia's skin. The coffee was awful in the highly specific way that conference room coffee always is. It met the technical legal definition of coffee, but offered zero comfort. Amalia arrived 7 minutes early. She precisely aligned her legal pads, poured a cup of the bitter sludge, and locked her eyes on the frosted glass door. William walked in at exactly 1:58. He spotted her instantly. She watched his chest expand as he pulled in a sharp, measured breath. A deliberate intake of oxygen designed to buy a man 2 seconds to glue his professional mask back together. He wore a crisp navy jacket, a thick folder of schematics clamped tightly under his arm. His light brown hair was slightly damp at the temples, blown back by the biting October wind, carrying the faint, crisp scent of the incoming autumn chill. He looked, she noted with a sudden spike of irritation, exactly like a man who had spent the last 2 years becoming exactly who he had planned to become. "Ms. Voss," he said. The suffocating formality was almost comical. Almost. "Mr. Hart," she replied, her tone matching his precise, bloodless register. Gerald shuffled in 30 seconds later, trailing 2 of the 3 Hartwell siblings. Deborah possessed the permanent, rigid posture of a woman chronically disappointed by the universe, while Marcus vibrated with the manic energy of a man who had recently discovered the phrase sunk cost fallacy and was wielding it like a blunt instrument against his own family. The 3rd sibling, Patricia, dialed in via video link from Phoenix and spent the first agonizing 10 minutes trapped on mute. For 45 grueling minutes, Amalia executed her job flawlessly. She listened actively, deployed incisive questions, and expertly translated the raw emotional chaos of a bitter family dispute into the sterile, actionable language of legal frameworks. She actively avoided looking at William unless absolutely dictated by professional necessity. Yet, she was hyper-aware of his presence the entire time. Her skin prickled with a low-frequency hum every time he shifted in his leather chair. He occupied space differently than anyone else in the room. His presence registered like a deep bass note beneath the shrill bickering. He was brilliant at his job. She hadn't expected that fact to grate on her nerves, but it did. When he walked Gerald through the intricate renovation schematics, speaking fluently about load-bearing walls, historical preservation, and the exact angles of natural light, his voice deepened with genuine, unfeigned passion. She caught herself leaning in, unconsciously absorbing the deep resonance of his voice, simply for the pleasure of it, before violently, mentally snapping her attention back to her legal pad. The meeting adjourned at 3:40. When 2 people with 18 months of heavy, unspoken history find themselves alone in a sterile corporate hallway, they are faced with a stark binary choice. They can either bury their faces in their phones and let the silence swallow them whole, an efficient, cowardly, and entirely valid survival tactic, or one of them can finally shatter the silence. William shattered it. "Can I buy you a coffee?" He paused, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. A noticeably better coffee than whatever that sludge was. Amalia evaluated him coolly. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of his leather portfolio. The tension was subtle, masked by the practiced steadiness of a man highly trained in controlling his physical reactions, but she recognized the microscopic tremors. She utilized the exact same armor. "No," she said. "Okay." He gave a single short nod. He offered no pressure, no debate. "How are they?" The question bypassed all her sophisticated defenses. She had braced herself for clumsy apologies, for long-winded architectural explanations, for the heavily rehearsed emotional speeches that men like William meticulously constructed in advance. She had not prepared for a quiet, desperate "how are they?" delivered in a fluorescent hallway, weighted with the agonizing realization of a man who finally grasped the magnitude of what he was asking. "They're fine," she managed, her throat painfully tight. "The little girl, her eyes, I know." He stopped completely. He locked eyes with her for the first time since he had walked through the glass door. The raw, naked grief in his expression stripped away his polished exterior entirely. "Amalia." "Don't." Her voice was dangerously even, a thin sheet of ice over a raging current. "Not here." He nodded again. A jagged, unnameable emotion ripped across his face. Not quite hurt, but something terrifyingly close to true devastation. "When? Then?" She hoisted her leather tote onto her shoulder, the heavy strap biting into her collarbone. "I don't know that there's a when." She turned on her heel and marched to the elevator bank. She slammed the call button. She stood with her spine rigidly straight, her eyes boring holes into the brushed steel doors, fiercely proud of her ironclad composure for the 12 excruciating seconds it took them to slide open. Constructing armor against an enemy is simple. Constructing armor against a man who already knows the exact layout of all your vulnerable gaps requires an astronomical, draining expenditure of energy. With a stranger, you can simply project a generalized professional detachment. But with the man who once memorized the sound of your quietest weeping in the dark, the defense must be painstakingly custom-fitted to protect the deepest nerves. You don't realize how much blood you're bleeding into the suit until the battle is over and you're totally hollowed out. She pushed through the revolving glass doors and stood on the Denver pavement. The October wind ripped through her thin trench coat, instantly chilling her to the bone. She felt the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had been holding up the sky for far too long. She pulled out her phone and dialed Cora. "He's the architect on the case," she said flatly. A long, heavy silence echoed over the cellular network. "I explicitly told you to recuse yourself." "I am not recusing myself." "Amalia." Amalia pressed the cold glass of her phone against her flushed cheek. He asked how they were. Another silence, this one thick and dangerous. "What exactly did you say?" "Fine. And?" She tilted her head and stared at the Rockies. They loomed at the edge of the city, massive and indifferent, existing without apology, utterly uncaring about the human wreckage playing out in their shadow. "And nothing." I got in the elevator. "Okay." Cora exhaled slowly. "Okay. Are you all right?" Amalia replayed the raw fracture in his voice when he had choked out the words her eyes, the way the sentence had physically broken him in half. It was the distinct, shattering sound of a man realizing his entire life had just been violently rewritten. A single hot tear finally broke free, tracing a searing path down her cold cheek. "I don't know yet," she admitted, her voice finally cracking. "Ask me again tomorrow." Denver in November carried a uniquely vicious chill. He had thoroughly researched the climate, investing in heavy wool and adjusting his lungs to the altitude, yet the high desert frost possessed a trespassing quality. It slipped through the microscopic gaps in the window frames and slithered under the doors, rendering his new apartment a distinctly provisional space, regardless of the heat aggressively pumping from the vents. He secured the third-floor Rhino walk-up during his first week. It boasted massive west-facing windows that ignited into a spectacular burning amber precisely at 5:15 every evening. On his first night, he stood before that glass, watching the shadows stretch over his new empire, fiercely commanding himself to appreciate the view. The bitter bite of cheap drip coffee scalded his tongue as he forced down the realization that the triumph tasted entirely hollow. He methodically unpacked his life, architectural volumes first, followed by a precise, familiar arrangement of his drafting tools along the temporary desk. Later, he sat cross-legged on the bare hardwood floor, the spicy, peanut-heavy steam of takeout pad thai rising around him, as he obsessively reviewed the Meridian Group's initial project files. The blueprints represented everything he had ever sacrificed for: massive public infrastructure at scale, a sweeping mixed-use civic development designed to violently reshape 2 miles of neglected riverfront. This was the exact caliber of visionary work he had been aggressively chasing since his graduate school days. He swore his gratitude to the empty room every single morning, achieving a lifelong dream only to find it infected with a subtle, unnameable rot is a uniquely isolating agony. The triumph felt persistently off-kilter, like a masterfully designed room missing a crucial, foundational load-bearing beam. He maintained his self-imposed exile, honoring his own harsh terms to stay away. A dim, desperate corner of his mind secretly acknowledged that if her name had flashed across his screen in those early, solitary weeks, he would have answered on the first ring. He would have begged her to order him home. But his phone remained a dark, silent slab of glass. He framed her silence as ultimate proof of his own noble sacrifice, clinging to the belief that she was moving forward exactly as he had engineered. This self-deception functioned flawlessly for steadily diminishing increments of time. By the 3rd month, the sheer gravitational pull of the riverfront project swallowed him whole. Work offered a demanding, structurally satisfying refuge that the chaos of human connection severely lacked. He built a functional existence, exchanging long, technical monologues about poured concrete with a structural engineer named Dara, and sharing cheap wine with the couple downstairs over a shared router connection. He categorized his life as highly functional and successful. He was executing meaningful work and building a legacy of concrete and steel. Yet lurking beneath the professional veneer, an unshakable, persistent sensation of being utterly unfinished gnawed at his ribs. William possessed a highly architectural approach to his own emotional landscape, meticulously organizing his grief into distinct phases and timelines to be addressed only after the pressing, immediate crises were resolved. However, suppressed agony rarely waits for a convenient project phase. It accumulates. It solidifies. It quietly becomes load-bearing before the foundation even registers the strain. At the 8-month mark, a colleague's wedding dragged him back to her city. He spent the first 4 hours after landing successfully projecting the illusion that he had zero intention of seeing her. Then, driven by a violent magnetic pull, he piloted his rental car directly past her office building. He sat idling in the choked traffic, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel while a suffocating, heavy pressure crushed his lungs, a phantom pain he had spent 2/3 of a year professionally ignoring. He never stepped out of the vehicle. He caught a Sunday night flight back to Denver, staring blankly at the plastic seatback ahead of him for 3 sleepless hours. 14 months into his exile, he cracked the spine of a fresh sketchbook. This volume was entirely detached from the riverfront development. It was reserved exclusively for the private, structurally unsound geography of his memories. He had left his previous journal in their shared apartment, only to have it returned in a padded mailer weeks after his departure. The very sight of her precise, elegant handwriting on the shipping label had burned his retinas. He had shoved it onto a high shelf in the bedroom, refusing to unseal it again. This new book immediately filled with the sprawling oaks of the park near her street. He sketched her favorite ceramic mug resting on the kitchen table, the handle angled explicitly toward the window, exactly the way she always positioned it. He captured the specific, golden quality of Sunday afternoon light filtering into a room he had accidentally memorized down to the floorboards. He remained entirely consumed by her. He recognized this catastrophic structural failure within himself, with the same cold, professional certainty he applied to a compromised foundation. Fully aware that identifying the collapse did absolutely nothing to halt it, he snapped the sketchbook shut, burying it deep inside his desk drawer, and forced his eyes back to the municipal blueprints. Outside, the western sky erupted into its daily, spectacular amber, mocking him with its beauty, entirely without his permission. A single digital photograph survived the purge. It was an accidental relic salvaged from a friend's birthday dinner 2 years before he drafted that damning letter. In the image, she was laughing at something beyond the frame, her head tilted backward, her dark hair catching the warm, low light of the restaurant. William, captured in profile, was ignoring the camera entirely, completely transfixed by her face. He repeatedly ordered himself to permanently erase the file. He always failed. He only allowed himself to view it on the worst nights, after the architectural files were closed, and the oppressive silence of the apartment threatened to crush him. He would trace the glowing pixels of her cheekbone with the rough pad of his thumb, masochistically aggravating a festering wound he knew better than to touch. On the eve of the Hartwell mediation, he stared at that image until his eyes watered, aggressively lying to himself that it held zero power over him. He slammed the phone face down onto the nightstand. He lay paralyzed in the suffocating dark, listening to the distant, mechanical groan of a garbage truck grinding through the Denver streets. Her name remained permanently anchored in his contacts under A. He knew exactly where it lived. It happened on a crisp Saturday morning, an encounter that felt like the universe exercising a particularly cruel brand of bad judgment. Amalia had actively avoided any plans to be at the Cherry Creek Farmers Market. She had blocked off the morning for a mountain of Hartwell estate paperwork. But Luca had jolted awake at 5:30 a.m., radiating a focused, non-negotiable kinetic energy that could only be burned off with fresh air and constant motion. Mia, who monitored her brother's volatile moods with the intense scrutiny of a miniature meteorologist, immediately decided that screaming in solidarity was the only appropriate response. By 7:15, Amalia was pushing the double stroller down the bustling market path. The twins broadcast identical expressions of profound, sleepy satisfaction at the world, and Amalia gripped a heavily caffeinated macchiato she felt she had earned in blood. The market was vibrant in the specific way Denver outdoor markets excel. Artisanal honey vendors flanking a kettle corn stand, bleeding into a booth of hand-thrown ceramics, next to a man who, inexplicably, had built an entire business model around a single, aggressively spicy hot sauce. The morning air was sharp, bright, and cleansed by the altitude. Amalia felt her shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. She was dangerously close to feeling relaxed. She was distracted, carefully examining a bucket of freshly cut dahlias, their petals a deep, velvety burgundy, the exact shade of a bruised plum, when she heard Mia's sound. It wasn't her sharp distress wail nor her frantic hungry grunt. It was her interesting person sound. It was a highly specific, rapid-fire series of staccato syllables that Mia exclusively deployed when an object or a person had completely hijacked her attention. Amalia snapped her head up. William was crouched low on the asphalt, directly in front of the stroller. Whether he hadn't spotted Amalia yet, or had made the highly strategic, cowardly decision to initiate contact with the smaller, significantly less hostile targets first was irrelevant. He was squarely at the twins' eye level. His forearms rested heavily on his denim-clad knees, the fabric pulled taut against his thighs. He was staring at the children with an expression completely stripped of his usual guarded, professional armor. Mia was actively studying him. She subjected him to the same intense, unblinking focus she applied to dead bugs and shiny wrappers, her head cocked slightly to the left, her bottom lip jutting forward in deep concentration. Then, with the brisk, ruthless efficiency of a tiny conqueror claiming new territory, her small fist shot out and seized his jacket lapel. "Hi," William breathed. The word was a rough whisper, barely audible over the market noise, but it carried the crushing weight of a genuine revelation. Luca, who had been observing the entire exchange with the solemn, measured evaluation of a senior diplomat assessing a highly suspect applicant, apparently decided this stranger met his mysterious criteria. He slowly extended his small arm. He didn't reach for William. He simply offered his hand, palm facing up. It was an enigmatic gesture Amalia had never successfully decoded, but one Cora jokingly referred to as giving the peasants a chance. William hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, with excruciating gentleness, he pressed the broad pad of his index finger flat against Luca's tiny soft palm. Luca's small fingers immediately curled inward, locking William's hand in place. Amalia's breath hitched, trapping the crisp autumn air in her throat. The thick, green stems of the dahlias crushed against her palm as her grip reflexively tightened. She stood exactly 3 feet away, effectively paralyzed. She was staring at a man she still deeply, terrifyingly loved. She was staring at a man she was violently furious with, a man she had absolutely not forgiven, a man operating in total darkness regarding the magnitude of his own life. And there he was, crouching on the dirty asphalt, simultaneously tethered to both of her children. 2 violently opposing forces collided in her chest. The love, which she had spent 2 years aggressively pretending was dead, flared up, warm, terribly specific and agonizing in its stubborn persistence. Simultaneously, a newer, louder, and entirely rational terror spiked in her blood. This man has already detonated my life once without asking my permission. What happens when he decides to make another calculation? The delicate burgundy petals of the dahlias began to snap and bruise beneath her white-knuckled grip. She didn't feel a thing. William slowly lifted his gaze and caught her watching him. He rose to his full height with deliberate, agonizing slowness, moving with the careful caution of a man trying not to spook a cornered animal. He towered over the stroller, his face working frantically to construct a neutral mask, failing completely to hide the raw devastation underneath. "I wasn't following you," he said, his voice tight. "I live 4 blocks from here." "I know." She had known in a vague, abstract sense that the Cherry Creek district bordered his firm's new headquarters. She had completely failed to extrapolate what that geographical reality meant for her Saturday morning coffee runs. Mia stubbornly refused to release his lapel. She maintained her iron grip with the calm, terrifying certainty of a toddler who has decided a fixture is permanent, regardless of anyone else's opinion. "She does that," Amalia stated flatly. "What's—" He choked on the word, swallowing hard before trying again. "Can I ask their names?" The request was agonizingly careful. It was the heavily sanded, meticulously filed-down question of a man who had spent days obsessively turning the words over in his mind, desperate to strip away any sharp edges that might trigger her defenses. She had offered him less than nothing in that fluorescent hallway on Monday, and he hadn't dared to push. She recognized that he wasn't pushing now, either. He was pleading. "Mia," she said. She let her eyes flick down to her son. "Luca." A violent, microscopic tremor crossed William's features, a fast, involuntary flinch that vanished before she could fully categorize it. His jaw flexed, a hard knot of muscle popping beneath his beard. He stared at Luca, who was still evaluating him with that ancient, unnerving patience, and then shifted his gaze back to Mia, who had just confidently added her second fist to his ruined jacket lapel. "How old?" he asked. His voice cracked on the second word. 1 and 5 months. She stood perfectly still and watched the brutal, terrifying math compute behind his eyes. She had known this exact moment was coming. She had anticipated it since the suffocating silence in the park, since the icy confrontation in the conference room, since the very second she realized sharing a city meant this collision was inevitable. She had arrogance enough to believe she was armored for it. She had been wildly, catastrophically wrong. You can rehearse the blistering monologue in the shower for a year. You can perfectly calibrate the venom in your voice, anticipating the confrontation, the apologies, and the long-overdue bloodletting reckoning. But you can never account for the staggering, quiet destruction of seeing him be gentle with your children. You cannot account for your daughter clutching his coat, like she possesses some genetic memory you've spent 2 years trying to erase. You absolutely cannot account for your son offering his fragile, trusting hand, and watching the man you are determined to hate receive that tiny gesture like it is the only thing anchoring him to the earth. The human heart simply refuses to adhere to the rigid, protective schedules we desperately try to enforce. "Amalia," William rasped. His voice dropped an octave, vibrating with a desperate, heavy steadiness. "I need to ask you something." "Not here." "I know." He stared down at Mia. He studied the slope of her nose, the unruly dark curls curling at her temples, and the deep sage-green eyes that were currently dissecting him with the exact same hyper-focused intensity he used to dissect structural blueprints. "I know, but I have to ask." She forced herself to wait. "Are they?" He abruptly cut himself off. He lifted his head and locked his eyes onto hers. She saw the exact same desperate, agonizing precision in his face that she had read in that goodbye letter. The terrified hyper-focus of an architect who realizes that placing a single word in the wrong load-bearing position will collapse the entire structure. "Is there something I should know?" The chaotic noise of the farmer's market blurred into white noise. A vendor laughed uproariously 2 booths down. A small child loudly demanded to know why the strawberry jam was so expensive. Amalia let the silence stretch. She stared at the man who had claimed to love her, the man who had abandoned her, the man who had walked away completely ignorant of the collateral damage he left in his wake. She stared at a man who was now holding his breath, keeping his body painfully still, and actively offering her the exact thing he had stolen from her 2 years ago: the right to choose. The realization stung like iodine in a fresh cut. "Not here," she repeated, but her tone had fundamentally shifted. The sharp defensive ice had cracked. William caught the subtle difference instantly. She watched his rigid shoulders drop a single, microscopic millimeter. It wasn't the slump of defeat. It was the ragged, oxygen-starved relief of a man who has just been informed that his execution has been temporarily stayed. Mia, apparently satisfied with her hostile takeover, abruptly uncurled her fists and released his jacket. Her mission was accomplished, even if the ultimate objective remained a mystery to everyone else. Amalia gripped the rubber handle of the stroller, violently wrenched it toward the paved path, and walked away without looking back. The crushed, bleeding stems of the burgundy dahlias remained locked in her fist. She had absolutely no memory of paying for them. Cora Mello had been securely anchored to Amalia's life since their brutal 1L year of law school. That shared history meant Cora possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Amalia's existence. She had survived 2 punishing bar exams, the catastrophe of 1 spectacularly terrible apartment, 4 major professional implosions, the agonizing rise of William, the devastating crater left by William, the terrifying isolation of the pregnancy, the fluorescent nightmare of the NICU, the grueling first year of twins, and now this, a development that easily ranked as the most radioactive item on the list, eclipsing even the NICU. Cora breached the threshold of the short-term rental on Saturday evening. She arrived heavily armed with 2 bottles of Malbec, the specific, brutally spicy Thai takeout Amalia actually tolerated, and the hyper-focused, predatory attention of a woman who had been running a continuous, parallel legal analysis of the Washington Park incident for roughly 36 hours. She immediately dropped to the hardwood floor, allowing Luca to utilize her as a human jungle gym. Across the room, Mia had aggressively claimed the center of her foam playmat, conducting a rigorous, silent audit of her entire toy inventory, picking up each block, scrutinizing it for flaws, and discarding it with prejudice. Amalia's corporate-sponsored apartment for the month was compact but undeniably excellent. It boasted soaring ceilings, solid architectural bones, and a narrow balcony that perfectly framed the jagged silhouette of the Rockies as they bled into rose and gold. "You have to tell him," Cora stated flatly, not bothering to look up as Luca triumphantly summited her shoulder and began a logistical assessment of her earrings. "I am acutely aware of that. You have to tell him before he finishes the equation himself. I am aware of that too. Because if he runs the numbers and hits the bottom line without you, Cora, I am simply entering it into the record that your window of opportunity is rapidly slamming shut. It's been closing since you locked eyes in the park." Cora finally lifted her head. Her face settled into that highly specific, terrifyingly effective blend of deep affection and utter ruthlessness that was her natural resting state. "He is an architect, Amalia. His entire brain is wired for structural math. He is going to figure it out. He's already running the numbers." Amalia gathered a messy stack of Hartwell depositions, aggressively shoved them to the far end of the sofa, and collapsed into the cushions. The leather groaned under her weight, a physical echo of her exhaustion. He cornered me at the market this morning. Is there something I should know? That was his exact phrasing. Cora went completely still. And your testimony? Not here. Which means you have essentially confessed. Which means I have formally acknowledged that a deposition is required. Amalia stared grimly at the dark ruby surface of her wine. Those are two entirely different legal maneuvers. Cora Mello requires a moment of dedicated attention because she is far too vital to this narrative to be relegated to the margins. Cora is the woman who physically forced Amalia into the passenger seat for every single prenatal appointment during those suffocating first 3 months when Amalia was drowning in a dissociative fog. Cora is the woman who held vigil in the sterile, terrifying purgatory of the hospital waiting room at 2:00 a.m., refusing to leave the premises until the neonatologist confirmed both infants were breathing independently. Most importantly, Cora is the woman who had never, not once, in 17 grueling months, uttered the words you should have told him. She withheld that judgment not because she lacked the opinion, but because she fundamentally understood that Amalia was already crushing herself beneath the weight of that knowledge. Yet tonight, Cora was finally weaponizing that sentence. She was deploying it because she loved Amalia fiercely enough to inflict the necessary pain when the tactical timing demanded it. He is not going to pull a vanishing act this time, Cora said softly. You have zero empirical evidence to support that claim. I have the evidence that he tracked you down at a crowded farmer's market on his Saturday off and actively engaged in a hostile cross-examination instead of sprinting in the opposite direction. That is circumstantial. He held Luca's hand, Cora interrupted, her voice dropping an octave. You literally just submitted that into evidence. Luca offered his hand and William held it. Amalia's jaw clamped shut. Mia abandoned her rigorous inventory. She executed a wobbly, determined march across the foam tiles, using the edge of the coffee table for leverage, until she reached the sofa. She slapped her small, sticky palm flat against Amalia's denim-clad knee. It was a physical check-in. Are you functioning? Translated from the silent, hyper-observant language of a 1-year-old. Amalia immediately covered Mia's tiny hand with her own, her thumb gently stroking the soft knuckles. He executed a unilateral decision 2 years ago, Amalia said, the old familiar acid burning the back of her throat. He calculated the variables, decided what was best for his career and my life, and terminated the contract without giving me the opportunity to offer a rebuttal. And now you are advising me to just hand him. I am advising you that your children are rapidly approaching consciousness, Cora cut in quietly. They are going to grow up and they are going to start asking discovery questions, and Exhibit A is going to be the identity of their father. She let the silence stretch for a heavy 3 seconds. I am not telling you to offer him a pardon. I am telling you to control the narrative before he pieces it together in isolation. Because if you let that happen, your first real conversation is going to be a bloodbath. Cora's logic was ironclad. Amalia, a woman who had built a lucrative career surgically extracting brutal truths from 12-page trust documents and hostile, multi-generational family disputes, could not ignore the precedent. She understood the critical difference between a truth that was merely inconvenient to acknowledge and a truth that was fundamentally, structurally unavoidable. This truth was the foundation of the entire building. 2 hours later, Cora was gone. Luca was sealed into fresh, aggressively yellow pajamas, and Mia had finally surrendered to unconsciousness in the nursery. The half-empty bottle of Malbec stood like a monument on the coffee table. Amalia sat entombed in the heavy silence of the apartment, staring blankly at the glowing rectangle of her phone. A text from William sat in her notifications. He had fired it off at 6:47 p.m., precisely when she had been wrestling Luca into his crib. I'd like to take you up on that conversation, whenever you're ready. No pressure, no timeline, whenever you say. I'll be here. She analyzed the text 3 separate times. She flipped the phone face down against the wood, a deeply ingrained reflex designed to buy her brain a few seconds of peace without the screen demanding an immediate ruling. Then, she snatched it back up. Her thumbs flew across the glass. Tuesday, 7 p.m. There's a quiet place on 17th called Linden. I'll secure a table. She smashed the send arrow before her brain could draft a motion to dismiss. The notification chimed exactly 40 seconds later. I'll be there. She dropped the phone onto the cushion as if it were radioactive. Her pulse hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs, a violent snare drum echoing in the quiet room. She pushed herself off the sofa and walked silently down the hall, stopping in the darkened doorway of the nursery. Mia was deeply asleep. One small, perfect fist curled tightly against the breathable mattress. She was pulling deep, authoritative breaths, growing at a relentless, terrifying rate that still managed to ambush Amalia every single morning. "He doesn't know yet," she whispered to the shadows, her voice snagging on a knot of pure terror. "But he's going to." Mia didn't twitch. Beyond the glass, Denver was executing its nightly routine. The jagged peaks of the mountains dissolved into the black ink of the sky. The city grid flickered to life in a sprawling sea of orange sodium light, and the entire western horizon bruised into a deep, serious purple that cared absolutely nothing for anyone's carefully constructed timeline. Tuesday, she thought, the word tasting like copper on her tongue. Okay. Tuesday did not go according to plan. William arrived at Linden at exactly 6:58, immediately checking his phone to find a text from Amalia announcing a 15-minute delay. Luca had rejected his dinner with a highly specific, comprehensive stubbornness that derailed the entire evening schedule. William ordered a glass of sparkling water and claimed the secluded booth she had reserved against the exposed brick-back wall, locking his eyes on the entrance. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors at 7:19. She wore a tailored, dark wool coat, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. As she approached the table, William stood, not as a calculated performance of manners, but as a deeply ingrained reflex she had entirely forgotten he possessed. The restaurant was intimate, dimly lit by flickering table candles, and the air was thick with the rich, savory scent of wood smoke and roasted rosemary. She slid into the booth opposite him. They blindly pointed at items on the menu, dismissing the waiter as quickly as possible, and then the space between them violently compressed into silence. "Before you say anything," William began, his voice tight, "I want you to know I am not here to issue demands. I am not here to dictate what you owe me, or what I believe the next step should be. I'm just—" He broke off. He stared blankly at the condensation beading on his water glass, then raised his eyes to meet hers. "I found a photograph." Amalia froze. Her lungs simply stopped pulling in air. "On my phone. From 2 years ago. A week before I left." He placed his phone flat on the rustic wood table, screen facing up, and slowly slid it across the center line. It was an image she had never seen. A candid shot captured at a crowded dinner party at a mutual friend's house. It was Amalia, standing by the kitchen island, exactly 5 weeks pregnant. It was taken before her body had changed, before she had any inkling of the catastrophic shift inside her, back when she was confidently holding a crystal glass of cranberry juice and lying to the room that it was a vodka cranberry. William hadn't known either. When she discovered the truth, he had already been in Denver for a week. But tonight he had stared at that glowing screen. He had scrolled deep into his camera roll, driven by an impulse she refused to ask about, and he had checked the timestamp. He had ruthlessly executed the brutal arithmetic she had been dreading since their collision in the park. "I know," he said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper, "that your first instinct is to tell me my math is wrong, and I am begging you before you say the words, please don't. When you have obsessively managed a catastrophic secret for 18 months, the moment it detonates doesn't bring relief. It feels like a tectonic shift. It is the terrifying, groaning sound of a massive load-bearing structure, finally fracturing under pressure, violently rearranging the entire geography of your life whether you are prepared for the collapse or not." Amalia stared down at the glowing screen. She looked at the ghost of herself, holding a secret she didn't yet know was hers to carry. She slowly lifted her chin and met William's gaze, and then she finally unleashed the sentence she had been screaming in the dark for 17 months. She spoke the words she had cried to Cora, whispered to the ceiling at 3:00 a.m., and murmured to infants who couldn't comprehend the devastation of the syllables. You didn't let me choose. The words struck the table with devastating precision. She didn't deliver them as a frantic accusation begging for a defense. She dropped them as an immovable, concrete fact that instantly consumed all the oxygen in the room. You executed a unilateral decision for both of us, she said, her voice dangerously calm. Without asking my input, without giving me a single second to offer a rebuttal. And I was pregnant, William. I was carrying them when I read that goddamn invoice on the counter. I found out 6 days after you walked out. I had your new number burning a hole in my phone and I almost called you. I almost begged. She choked, forcing herself to swallow the rising panic. She steadied her breathing. But you had been so arrogantly certain. You had already ruled on the matter. You explicitly ordered me not to look for you. And I realized, if a man is willing to abandon a life he knows and loves without a second thought, what does that say about his capacity to stay for the hard parts? The restaurant continued its oblivious rhythm around them. Crystal wine glasses chimed against porcelain plates. A burst of raucous laughter erupted from a large party near the bar. William remained completely silent. The muscles in his jaw visibly jumped. He kept both hands pressed flat against the scarred wood of the table, his knuckles bone white. He was surrendering the floor to her entirely, which was simultaneously exactly what she required and the most agonizing way he could have reacted. I didn't call, she continued, her fingernails digging half-moons into her own palms under the table, because I was furious. I was blinded by it, William. I wasn't angry that you took the job. I understood the Meridian contract. I knew what that scale of infrastructure meant to you. I was enraged because you looked at 4 years of a shared life and unilaterally decided my future for me. You concluded I was better off without you. You assumed I wouldn't follow you, that I wouldn't even try to compromise. You left a cowardly letter demanding I stay away, and you didn't afford me one single solitary chance to fight for us. She felt the pure, clarifying rage cresting inside her. It wasn't a hysterical flood. It was the sharp, lethal force of a weapon she had spent 2 years meticulously sharpening. I might have moved to Denver, she stated flatly. I don't know. Maybe I would have refused to leave my firm and that would have been the end of it. Maybe I would have told you to pack my bags. Maybe I would have asked for a 1-year delay. I will never know what my ruling would have been. Because you actively stole my right to choose, and that is the one unforgivable. Her voice violently fractured on the last word. She took a sharp breath, brutally wrestling her composure back into place. That is the thing, she finished, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper, that I am still angry about. William's response in that exact moment defined the entire evening. He didn't mount a defense. He didn't deploy the usual cowardly excuses. I was trying to protect your career, or you always swore you'd never leave your city. He didn't offer a single mitigating factor that would have technically been true but would have incinerated the moment. He simply looked at the woman he had loved, the woman he had abandoned, the woman he had spent 2 years mourning with agonizing architectural precision, and he allowed her absolute fury to stand unchallenged. Then he spoke. You're right. 2 words, 0 qualifications. No defensive pivot, just an absolute surrender. I convinced myself I was doing the noble thing, he rasped. I thought. He cut himself off, shaking his head sharply. That is not an excuse. I refuse to dress it up in noble intentions. You are entirely right. I made a massive structural decision that was not mine to make alone, and I did it because I was a terrified coward. I was terrified that if I looked you in the eye and asked, you would tell me to stay, and I would stay, and eventually resent you for it. Or worse, you'd tell me to go, and it would completely destroy me. So I took the coward's way out and silenced you. He held her gaze, his face totally stripped of any polished professional armor. I was a coward, and I was completely ignorant of what I was actually walking away from, but my ignorance doesn't absolve my cowardice. No, she agreed. the word tasting like ash. It absolutely doesn't. Are they mine? He didn't phrase it as a question. The math was already verified. But he was asking her for permission to enter it into the official record. He was actively giving her the floor. Yes, she said. The single syllable hit the table like a lead weight, the final exhausting step at the end of a grueling marathon. William squeezed his eyes shut. He held them tightly closed for 3 agonizing seconds. When he finally opened them, the whites were flooded with red, the irises shining with unshed tears he was violently fighting to suppress. "I have missed," he choked out, his voice cracking violently on the harsh consonants. "A year and 5 months. Yes." I missed their first words. Mia clearly stated no at 9 months. Luca demanded more at 10, just in case you needed the exact timeline of what your absence cost. The cruelty slipped out sharper than she had intended. He absorbed the blow without flinching. "I want to know the entire timeline," he said, his voice trembling. "Everything. I want to know every single microscopic detail. Not because I think it earns me retroactive credit or changes the damage I did. I know it doesn't. But because they are." He choked again, pressing his palms harder into the table as if trying to ground himself. "Because they exist in the world. And I didn't know. And Amalia, I swear to God, I need you to understand that if I had known, if you had just told me." "I know." She cut him off. And she did know. That was the most agonizing variable in the entire equation. She knew with absolute certainty that the invoice on the counter would never have been written. She knew that the calculation of a man weighing his ambition against his relationship was fundamentally different than the calculation of a man weighing his ambition against his own flesh and blood. She had acknowledged this truth in the darkest, most brutally honest corners of her own mind for a very long time. Understanding his hypothetical reaction didn't diminish her rage. It simply tangled the fury into a much more complicated, exhausting knot. They remained in the booth for another hour. The waiter eventually deposited 2 plates of untouched braised short ribs between them. The dialogue shifted into the cautious, halting territory of the aftermath. 2 people navigating the smoking crater of a detonated secret, entirely unsure of where the safe footing lay. "I want to formally meet them," William stated quietly. "If you will permit it. I am not establishing terms right now. I am not going to ambush you with a custody lawyer or demand weekends. I am simply asking for permission to be introduced to my children." She studied him. She looked at the man who had been the focal point of her burning rage for 2 years, noting how completely hollowed out and desperate he looked sitting across from her. "I need to consider it," she said flatly. "Okay. That means I am taking it under advisement. It does not mean yes. I completely understand." She reached for her dark wool coat. He immediately stood up from the booth. The same ingrained reflex. She noted with a sudden, sharp pang of resentment how much she had missed the safety of that gesture. "William," she said, pausing at the edge of the table. He froze, waiting. "Her name is Mia Claire," she said, her voice finally softening just a fraction. "His is Luca James." She let the names hang in the air. "I decided you had the right to know their full names." She turned and walked out into the biting Denver night. As the heavy door swung shut behind her, she heard the distinct scrape of a wooden chair, the sound of a man slowly collapsing back into a booth, entirely alone, clutching the very first fragments of a family he hadn't known existed until 4 days ago. She held her composure until she slammed the door of her SUV. Then she gripped the leather steering wheel, dropped her forehead against her knuckles, and wept with violent, exhausted relief. When her lungs finally stopped burning, she put the car in gear and drove home to their children. The hospital assigned her room 214. Its single window offered a bleak, uninterrupted view of the concrete parking garage. She couldn't have cared less. During those agonizing 2.5 days leading up to and immediately following the delivery, scenic vistas were entirely irrelevant. She arrived armed with a meticulous birth plan because she was Amalia Voss, and Amalia generated plans the way other people metabolized oxygen, automatically, continuously as a fundamental baseline for survival. The document clearly dictated, absolutely no epidural unless medically mandated, immediate skin-to-skin contact, delayed cord clamping, and a specific Spotify playlist titled, "This Is Fine," that she had aggressively curated at 3:00 a.m. during her 7th month, while stress-eating saltines and refusing to break down. Of that intricately constructed plan, she successfully executed exactly 2 items: the playlist and the saltines she had shoved into her hospital bag on a sudden desperate intuition. Mia arrived violently at 34 weeks and 4 days, an acceleration no one had authorized. Luca followed a terrifying 6 minutes later. They were both devastatingly small. Their translucent skin stretched tight over fragile ribs, their tiny chests heaving with an urgency that sat like a stone in Amalia's own chest. There was simply too much air between their fragile bodies and the robust size they were mathematically supposed to be. The neonatal team rushed them to the NICU before Amalia's exhausted brain could even process the empty bassinet beside her bed. She lay paralyzed in room 214, the steady, mechanical hum of the parking garage echoing through the glass, and thought, "I need to call someone." She called her mother. Within 4 hours, her mother was boarding a transatlantic flight from Lisbon. She did not call William Hart. She possessed his new Denver number. She had memorized the digits with the same bitter repetition you use to memorize a poison control hotline, a string of numbers you pray you never have to dial. The decision she finalized in that sterile room requires absolute, unflinching precision. She did not withhold the truth out of pure, vindictive hatred. She had loved him deeply. She still loved him, which was its own unique, suffocating brand of torture. She chose silence because she was lying utterly alone in a hospital bed at 35 weeks, her body having barely survived a trauma it had not consented to. The mere thought of dialing the man who had cowered behind a written invoice, who had unilaterally decided her life was better without his presence, and begging for his attention felt like a fatal humiliation. It would have broken the last intact piece of her spine. He had already stolen her right to choose her own future. She refused to humiliate herself by begging him to reconsider the variables now. The NICU housed 22 glowing incubators, the vast majority occupied. The nursing staff glided through the dimly lit ward with a focused, quiet efficiency that Amalia found intensely anchoring. It was the absolute antithesis of panic, the silent, practiced language of professionals who understood that unshakable steadiness was the only currency that mattered here. On the second day, a veteran nurse named Teresa guided her through the labyrinth of wires and plastic. Teresa stood beside each incubator, her voice a calm, unhurried metronome, translating the terrifying data, which monitors indicated stability, which fluctuating numbers were acceptable, and which specific alarms mandated immediate intervention. Mia's digital readouts remained stubbornly stable. Luca's oxygen levels, however, executed a terrifying dive on the first night, demanding 2 grueling hours of hyper-vigilant observation and a rapid adjustment to his nasal cannula. For those 120 minutes, Amalia sat entirely frozen beside the plastic box. She locked her muscles, terrified that even the microscopic rustle of her paper gown might somehow disrupt the fragile negotiations happening inside his tiny lungs. He fought his way back. His numbers stabilized right before midnight. Teresa materialized with a steaming cup of chamomile tea. "Do you have family en route?" Teresa asked quietly. It wasn't a judgment, it was simply the logistical question a seasoned NICU nurse asks at midnight. "My mother lands at 6 a.m. "Good." Teresa paused, her eyes tracking the steady green line on Luca's monitor. "Is there anyone else you need us to contact?" Amalia stared down at Luca. He was impossibly tiny, a fragile collection of dark hair, shallow breaths, and miniature hands that hadn't yet learned how to grasp. She calculated the exact cost of making that call. She imagined saying the words, "There is an architect in Denver who is entirely ignorant of this reality, and I need you to track him down." "No," she said, her voice devoid of any inflection. "There is no one else." She spoke the lie aloud, and in that fluorescent-lit midnight with the Rocky Mountains looming somewhere beyond the concrete walls, It officially became the truth. It cost her a piece of her soul she didn't yet have a name for. It is incredibly easy to condemn her from the outside. The instinct is to argue the morality of the situation. She had a fundamental obligation. He had a biological right to know. And technically, that argument is legally sound. But put yourself in room 214 for just a minute. Sit in the bruised yellow light filtering in from the parking garage and feel the crushing weight of being abandoned by a man who claimed to love you, yet still refused to ask you to stay. Feel the specific, suffocating isolation of being the collateral damage in someone else's ambition. Then ask yourself, exactly how much grace are you required to extend to a man while you are actively bleeding out from a wound he inflicted? Her mother breached the hospital doors at exactly 7:15 a.m. She instantly seized control with the terrifying, efficient authority unique to matriarchs when a crisis demands intervention. She physically rearranged the sterile room and interrogated the attending physicians with the polite, immovable force of a woman who had been successfully managing catastrophes since before Amalia was born. She reached through the sterile portholes of the incubators, resting her hands lightly on the infants, and murmured fiercely in Portuguese that they were fiercely loved, utterly perfect and absolutely required to survive. Eventually they did. 8 agonizing days in the NICU. 8 days composed of 15-minute visiting windows, fluctuating vital signs, and the heavy suspended animation unique to rooms where the primary objective is simply waiting for lungs to inflate properly. And then finally, discharge. A sterile borrowed apartment. A heavy double stroller with a maddeningly stubborn left wheel. On their first night home, Amalia collapsed into a bruised armchair, anchoring one swaddled infant to each side of her chest. Her mother slept the exhausted sleep of the dead in the adjoining room. Below the window, the city traffic provided a steady, indifferent hum. "Your father has absolutely no idea you exist," she whispered into the dark, the words tasting like copper. She spoke to Mia, who was already deeply unconscious, and to Luca, who was watching her with that ancient, patient focus he had seemingly been born possessing. And that was not my initial choice. He forced his calculation first. So I made mine. She looked down at Luca. He blinked slowly, as if meticulously deliberating her confession. "I am not entirely convinced I made the right one," she admitted, a hot tear finally escaping and tracking down her exhausted face. "But it was mine." The memory slammed violently into the present. Sitting in the dimly lit restaurant on Tuesday evening, Amalia had watched William Hart physically break apart as he rasped, "I have missed a year and 5 months." She witnessed the jagged destruction of a man attempting to process a reality that offered no clean angle of entry. Deep within the heavily armored core she fought so hard to keep neutral, she felt the crushing weight of everything she had carried alone, and simultaneously, the agonizing weight of everything she had actively stolen from him. Both truths were equally valid. They occupied the exact same space in the room. This was the fundamental tragedy of their situation. It offered no clean legal resolution, no simple distribution of blame. It was a massive, tangled knot of moral complexity, birthed from a decision made in pure agony, carrying consequences that neither of them possessed the foresight to anticipate. Mia Claire, Luca James. She had named them both, entirely alone, without a single conflicting opinion. That too had been her absolute right. He texted on Thursday afternoon. Amalia had fully anticipated a message begging for access to the children. She had meticulously drafted a sterile, lawyerly response regarding boundaries, the necessity of gradual timing, and her absolute authority over the pacing of their introduction. He neatly bypassed her defenses. "Can I bring you coffee? Whatever you need from the morning. No agenda, just coffee." She stared blankly at the glowing text bubble for 90 excruciating seconds. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed between telling him to go to hell and typing her order. "I'm on 14th. There's a place called Huckleberry. 8 a.m. He was already waiting when she rounded the corner at 7:58. He stood out on the freezing pavement rather than waiting in the heated shop, holding 2 steaming paper cups. She instantly recognized the tactic. He was remaining visible outside, offering her the physical space to abort the meeting before she committed to opening the door. He handed her the cup without making a dramatic production of the gesture. It was flawlessly executed, a heavily caffeinated oat milk flat white. She hadn't mentioned her order. He had simply retained the useless data point from 2 years ago, silently offering it up without demanding a medal for his memory. She noticed. She refused to give him the satisfaction of acknowledging it aloud. They walked the frigid Denver blocks for 40 minutes. They sought refuge in the sterile, emotionally safe territory of the Hartwell estate mediation. It was infinitely simpler than navigating the radioactive crater of their shared history. They seamlessly transitioned to discussing his latest project, a sprawling new branch library in Lodo, the first public library the city had commissioned in over a decade. Despite her ironclad intention to remain utterly indifferent to his architectural triumphs, she found herself genuinely drawn into the details. He spoke with quiet reverence about the structural integrity of the concrete facade, explaining how his firm had sourced it from a specific quarry an hour past the foothills, selecting a unique gray stone that shifted color depending on the precise angle of the afternoon sun. In return, she offered him microscopic fragments of the twins. She shared the mundane, harmless data, the obsessive, militaristic way Mia aligned her wooden blocks before permitting herself to play, and the terrifyingly proud, smug expression Luca wore after successfully hacking the television remote. She offered these fragments because William was absorbing the information with a devastating, total focus. He understood he was being handed fragile gifts, not mere data points. He never interrupted. He never performed a heavy sigh or a theatrical wince of regret. He simply absorbed her words like a man dying of thirst. There is a distinct, lethal danger inherent in hope. Hope, fundamentally, is not the enemy. Hope is a reasonable, necessary biological mechanism for surviving traumatic events. The catastrophic flaw of hope is that it strips you of your armor. To actively hope for a positive outcome is to verbally confess that you desire it, and admitting you want something is the precise moment you acknowledge you have something to lose. Amalia had spent 2 grueling years violently pruning her own hope back to the absolute functional minimum. She was a master of emotional austerity. The perfectly remembered flat white was severely compromising her structural integrity. Saturday morning arrived. She hadn't explicitly invited him to the apartment, but she had notably failed to explicitly forbid it. They had discussed her chaotic weekend morning routine on Thursday, and William Hart had always possessed a terrifyingly accurate ability to read the negative space between what was spoken and what was permitted. He knocked at exactly 9:00 a.m. Mia registered the sound before Amalia even looked up from her coffee. From her command post on the kitchen floor, where she was currently executing a hostile takeover of the lower cabinets, aggressively scattering Tupperware across the linoleum, she issued her rapid-fire interesting person syllables. Amalia unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. William stood in the hallway clutching a grease-stained bakery bag. "Banana muffins," he announced quietly. "I realized I have absolutely no idea what toddlers eat. They eat literally everything, including objects that hold 0 nutritional value. Good to know for the structural planning phase." She stepped aside and let him cross the threshold. The first hour was an agonizing exercise in hypervigilance. William navigated the small, sunlit apartment with the extreme caution of a man walking through a minefield. He clearly understood that this territory did not belong to him. Every single detail, the meticulous organization of the bookshelves, the color-coded sleep schedules magnetized to the refrigerator, represented a universe of choices she had painstakingly constructed in his absence. He treated the space with total reverence, actively asking for permission before touching a single object. He lowered his large frame onto the foam playmat, physically dropping to the twins' level, and allowed them to dictate the terms of engagement. Luca initiated contact first. He approached the towering architect with his signature methodology, intense evaluation preceding any physical engagement. He maintained a strict 2-foot perimeter while he conducted a thorough visual assessment of William's leather boots. He then upgraded his scrutiny to the laces. Finally, he conducted a sweeping review of William's large, steady hands resting on his knees. Apparently satisfied that the man was structurally sound, Luca simply climbed into his lap. He didn't hover near him or lean against his leg. He crawled directly into the center of William's lap, with the absolute boneless entitlement of a child who had decided this was a perfectly logical place to reside and saw no reason to negotiate the terms. William froze completely. His breath hitched audibly in the quiet room. His large hands hovered awkwardly in the air, terrified to make contact. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered his palms and rested them feather-light against Luca's small back. He looked like a man terrified that applying even an ounce of pressure might shatter the boy into dust. Luca settled his weight against William's chest. He blindly reached behind him, produced a battered cardboard picture book from the ether. Amalia had long ago surrendered trying to track his hidden inventory, and shoved it backward toward William's face. "He is formally requesting a read aloud," Amalia interpreted from the kitchen island. William stared blankly at the colorful cover, then down at the small head tucked under his chin, and finally up at Amalia. A muscle in his jaw jumped violently. His face was executing a massive, complex internal renovation, frantically reinforcing the load-bearing walls of his composure, while the entire foundation shifted beneath him. Okay. His execution was terrible. He lacked any natural instinct for the bouncy, sing-song rhythm of toddler literature. He read the simple sentences with the grave, measured cadence of a man analyzing a complex legal contract, butchering the rhymes and inserting pauses in entirely inappropriate places. Luca couldn't have cared less. He melted heavily against William's chest, a warm, contented weight perfectly satisfied with the arrangement. You recognize the specific terror of this exact moment. It is the distinct, paralyzing sensation of watching an unavoidable catastrophe manifest in real time. Amalia had poured concrete over her heart to defend against this precise scenario. She had engineered load-bearing walls to keep this man out. And now, she was standing in her own kitchen, watching those massive structures quietly, efficiently redistribute the weight to accommodate him. The walls weren't crumbling or exploding in dramatic fashion. They were simply adapting to bear his load. That silent adaptation was infinitely more terrifying than a total collapse. From across the foam tiles, Mia had been rigorously auditing the Luca situation with the intense scrutiny of a senior safety inspector, evaluating a new prototype. She eventually concluded the data was satisfactory. She executed her wobbly, determined march, a skill she had only mastered 6 weeks prior, her hips swaying unsteadily but her forward momentum undeniable, and planted herself directly in front of William. She stared up at him. He stared back. Luca had already succumbed to a heavy sleep against his chest, a fact William had entirely failed to register because he was totally captivated by the fierce, assessing gaze of his daughter. Mia slapped both small palms flat against his denim-clad knee to anchor herself. Then she began the arduous ascent. It wasn't a smooth operation. She grunted with the physical effort, slipping once before finding her footing. Finally, she wedged herself perfectly against the empty side of his chest, fitting her small body into the negative space with the exact precision of a missing puzzle piece clicking into place. William didn't utter a single syllable. His strong arms instinctively curled around both of them. A primal protective reflex he was executing flawlessly without any prior training. Amalia stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her knuckles turning white around a coffee mug that had gone stone cold 20 minutes ago. She watched her twin children sleeping soundly, anchored to the chest of their father. The dam finally broke. The massive, terrifying wave of love she had spent 2 years obsessively managing, keeping it chilled, contained, and safely under lock and key, violently breached containment. It flooded her chest, a physical ache that burned the back of her throat. It was warm, devastatingly specific, and entirely indifferent to the rigid defensive schedule she had engineered. She violently pivoted away, fixing her eyes blindly on the marble countertop. She stared intensely at the bouquet of deep burgundy dahlias she had unconsciously purchased at the farmer's market. The bruised, plum-colored petals were still vibrant, still holding their shape against the inevitable decay. She forced herself to breathe. She waited 3 full minutes until she trusted her voice not to shatter. She turned back to the living room. You can stay for lunch, she said quietly. William snapped his head up. A profound, silent earthquake ripped across his features. It wasn't a smile of victory or a celebration. It was the heavy, devastated awe of a man who fully grasped the astronomical weight of the concession she had just handed him. "Okay," he whispered, his voice thick and raw. "Thank you." It happened on a quiet Wednesday evening, exactly 11 days after the collision at the restaurant. Putting the twins down had been a grueling, tactical battle. Mia harbored deep, aggressively vocal opinions regarding the proper sequence of her bedtime routine, and Luca had stubbornly decided that sibling solidarity required him to fight off sleep until his sister finally surrendered, dragging the ordeal out by an agonizing 40 minutes. By the time Amalia finally slipped out of the nursery and clicked the door shut, the apartment was blanketed in the heavy, ringing silence that only exists in the immediate aftermath of a hurricane. Her spine ached, a dull throb pulsing at the base of her neck as she leaned her forehead against the cool, painted wood of the hallway door. William was waiting in the kitchen. He had already scrubbed the dinner pans and wiped down the counters, a silent, domestic penance he had seamlessly integrated into his routine sometime during the second week, without ever asking for permission. He stood leaning heavily against the marble island, the steam from his mug curling into the dim air, his eyes locked on the jagged silhouette of the mountains through the balcony glass. The dying sun was actively bleeding across the western range, bruising the peaks in deep shades of violet and rose. She sank into a chair at the small, cheap dining table she had inherited with the corporate rental. He immediately pulled out the chair opposite hers. The cramped geometry of the furniture forced their knees dangerously close, the air between them thick and crackling with unspent energy. "I need to tell you something," she murmured, her fingers tracing the raised grain of the faux wood laminate. "Something I have never confessed to anyone, not even Cora." William slowly lowered his mug to the table, the heavy ceramic clinking softly against the wood. "During the pregnancy," she began, her voice dangerously fragile, "specifically around the 4th month when the blinding terror finally bleeds into a bone-deep exhaustion, I forced myself to have a brutal internal reckoning. I debated whether I was withholding the truth out of pure protective principle or out of toxic anger." She dropped her gaze to her empty hands, her thumbnails digging ruthlessly into her cuticles. "I convinced myself it was principle. I built a bulletproof case that you had executed your choice, so I was fully justified in executing mine. I rationalized that burying the secret was the only way to shield my children from a man who had already mathematically concluded his life was vastly improved without us." She stopped, swallowing against a sudden, sharp tightness in her throat. "That was only a fraction of the truth," she confessed. "The rest was pure, concentrated rage. I was so violently angry, William. Guarding that secret felt like the absolute only piece of leverage I possessed after you systematically stripped every other choice away from me." Speaking the words aloud stripped away the final layer of her armor. She was actively surrendering the moral high ground, confessing to the ugly, complicated reality of her own vengeance. Acknowledging that her silence was heavily polluted by spite required a terrifying, agonizing vulnerability. William remained perfectly paralyzed. He anchored his entire focus onto her, absorbing her confession with the heavy, unblinking intensity of a man bracing for a physical blow. "I genuinely believe I would have told you eventually," she continued, her eyes tracking a single drop of condensation sliding down his mug. "I would have done it purely for Mia and Luca. They didn't sign up for this crossfire. They simply exist in the world, and they possess a father, and I knew that eventually, that reality would become their inherent right to know, rather than my secret to hoard." She exhaled a long, ragged breath. "I just kept cowering and pushing the deadline. I promised myself I'd reach out at 6 months, then at a year, then when they were old enough to comprehend the concept. I kept moving the goalposts." She shook her head bitterly. "And then the Hartwell case dragged me back to Denver." "The case," he echoed softly. "The case." She let out a hollow, scraped sound that died before it could become a laugh. "I aggressively lied to myself. I swore I could compartmentalize the mediation, maintain absolute professional sterility, and prove to the universe that I was entirely over you. Were you? She lifted her chin and met his gaze head-on. No. He gave a slow, heavy nod. Her raw honesty visibly unlatched something tight inside his chest, granting him the unspoken permission to drop his own heavy defenses. I considered flying back, he admitted, his voice thick with regret. Constantly. During that agonizing first year, I actually booked a direct flight on a bleak weekend in March. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I canceled the ticket 3 hours later. I cowered behind the assumption that you had seamlessly moved on. I convinced myself that showing up uninvited would be a violently arrogant intrusion, especially since my phone had remained entirely silent. I typed out 11 different text messages. He physically flinched, absorbing the blow. What stopped you from hitting send? The invoice, she stated flatly. You explicitly ordered me to stay away. I read that goddamn paper and concluded that a man who orchestrates such a clean getaway has zero desire to be hunted down. Chasing you felt. She searched the air for the precise terminology. Pathetic. Undignified. Amalia. I am stating facts, William, not wielding them as weapons. You purposefully engineered a scenario where simply dialing your number felt like begging for scraps, and I absolutely refused to beg. She held his gaze, her eyes burning with a fierce, protective pride. I need you to grasp the mechanics of what you built. This is simply the structural reality of the situation. A profound, terrifying intimacy settled over the cramped dining table. It lacked the soft edges of romance. Instead, it possessed the brutal, foundational weight of a shared excavation. They were two architects of a massive disaster finally dropping their shields, surveying the smoking wreckage of their history with absolute, unsparing honesty. They were laying a dangerous new foundation, one capable of either supporting a future or permanently crushing them both. I should have consulted you, William rasped, stripping all theatrical remorse from his tone to deliver the naked truth. I should have placed the Meridian contract on the table and confessed I was completely torn. I owed you all the variables. Instead, I operated in total secrecy because I was paralyzed by terror. I was terrified of your power to make me stay, or your power to shatter me by letting me go. I executed a unilateral betrayal and cowardly disguised it as a protective sacrifice. Yes, she agreed softly. Every conceivable angle of that calculation was fundamentally corrupt. Absolutely. He studied her face, his eyes searching for a crack in her resolve. Does it mitigate the damage, even slightly, to know that the regret nearly hollowed me out? She evaluated the question carefully. Knowing it cost you something brings a specific type of comfort, she decided. I take zero pleasure in your suffering, William. But your agony proves the decision carried massive weight. It proves you didn't simply pivot your career trajectory while treating our entire history as an irrelevant footnote. You were the entire foundation, he stated with a quiet, immovable certainty. She believed him implicitly, which only tangled the emotional knot tighter. Tell me something new, she requested, suddenly desperate to pivot away from the heavy gravity of the past. About the twins. Something specific you've observed. He blinked, thrown by the sudden shift. Like what? Mia and Luca, you have occupied this apartment every single day this week. Present a piece of data that genuinely surprised you. He fell silent, his eyes drifting to the middle distance. She watched his mind work, tracking the familiar, intensely focused stare he utilized when calculating a complex problem. It was an old architectural quirk, a habit that used to oscillate between incredibly charming and deeply infuriating. She hadn't allowed herself to view it with any warmth for 2 years, but tonight, the familiarity of his concentration tugged dangerously at her chest. Luca actively monitors Mia, he finally answered, his voice softening with awe. Right before he surrenders to sleep, he deliberately turns his head to visually confirm her presence, and only then does he allow himself to fully settle. I caught him doing it yesterday, so I actively watched for it today. He refuses to clock out until he has verified her structural integrity. A violent melting warmth flooded Amalia's chest, actively dismantling another heavy brick in her emotional wall. He has maintained that protocol since the NICU, she whispered, a tight, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. The neonatal nurses constantly noted that their erratic heart rates would only fully stabilize when their incubators were pushed close together. William stared at her across the narrow expanse of the cheap table. The bruised mountain twilight had fully surrendered to the night, replaced by the sprawling electrical grid of Denver bleeding amber and stark white light through the balcony glass. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying the weight of a sacred oath. "Thank you for giving me that." The massive New York junket loomed on Thursday's calendar. It was a grueling gauntlet, 3 days, 4 high-profile press appearances, a keynote address for an international architecture symposium, and a high-stakes dinner with the board of the firm's most aggressive investor. His project manager had fired off the itinerary 3 weeks prior, her emails radiating the specific, highly caffeinated anxiety of a woman who understood exactly how much capital relied on William's physical presence. The printed schedule sat on his drafting table, the edges curling in the dry air of his office. He dialed her number on Tuesday morning. He gripped his phone tightly, staring down at the chaotic Denver traffic crawling below his office window, and quietly informed her he wasn't boarding the plane. "Patricia," she snapped instantly, her voice echoing the impending disaster at the symposium. "I am fully aware," William replied, his voice steady, refusing to absorb her panic. "Someone else can manage Patricia." A heavy, static-filled silence crackled over the line. "William, I am rearranging the board. I am not canceling the contract. I am shifting the logistics. There is a remote video uplink available for the keynote. The investor dinner is the only immovable variable, and I am actively working on a solution." "Why?" She demanded the word, not because she lacked comprehension, but because she required his verbal confirmation of the madness. "Because there are critical elements here in Denver that cannot be rescheduled," he stated, the leather of his desk chair creaking as he leaned forward, "and I am completely finished deciding that those are the elements forced to move." His project manager was livid. She rattled off a barrage of entirely valid, intensely logical arguments regarding professional suicide, the critical necessity of market visibility, and the volatile politics of the investor board. William absorbed every single reprimand. He let her burn through her adrenaline, holding his ground with the terrifying, quiet immovability of a man who knew the negotiation had concluded before he even picked up the phone. Rebuilding the fundamental architecture of a life's priorities rarely involves cinematic airport sprints or breathless declarations in the rain. It is a grueling, unglamorous demolition. It is the quiet absorption of heavy professional penalties, the exhausting endurance of reprimands from colleagues who care absolutely nothing for personal collateral damage, and the brutal dismantling of a schedule that took months of blood and sweat to engineer. William was no longer compartmentalizing his emotional life into the next fiscal quarter. He was violently shoving it to the dead center of the drafting table, treating it as the most critical, load-bearing project of his existence. It lacked any theatrical romance, but the sheer cost of the sacrifice gave it absolute, undeniable gravity. Cora Mello naturally detected the seismic shift by Friday morning. She had breached the apartment under the guise of visiting her godchildren, but her functional objective was to aggressively audit the shifting domestic ecosystem. She possessed a terrifyingly accurate analytical radar for Amalia's well-being. She stepped through the door to find William seamlessly operating the espresso machine in the kitchen, both toddlers happily destroying the living room rug, and Amalia hunched over her laptop at the dining table, fiercely projecting the illusion of a woman successfully concentrating on her legal briefs. "Good morning," Cora announced to the room at large. "Morning," William replied effortlessly. He handed her a perfectly steamed cappuccino without requiring a single verbal prompt. Cora accepted the ceramic mug. She scrutinized the latte art, shifted her dark eyes to the architect, and then locked a highly judgmental stare onto Amalia. Amalia shot back a desperate, wide-eyed look that clearly broadcast. "Stand down until later." Later officially commenced the second the twins slipped into unconsciousness. William had retreated to the guest bedroom to field a volatile contractor dispute regarding the Lodo library, leaving the women isolated on the narrow balcony. The thin, biting November wind whipped Amalia's hair across her face as they gripped their warm mugs. "He torpedoed the New York trip," Amalia confessed softly. "I am fully briefed. He mentioned it." Amalia snapped her head sideways. "You two are exchanging intelligence?" Luca presented him with a remarkably average pebble this morning, and William reacted with the solemn reverence of a man being handed the Hope Diamond. "We have officially bonded." Cora's tone was desert dry. "He is putting in the sweat equity, Amalia. I am acutely aware of his efforts. That was not my line of questioning." "You didn't actually ask a question. I am deposing you right now." Cora slammed her mug onto the metal balcony rail with a sharp clank. "What is your desired outcome? Disregard what is safe. Disregard the historical precedent. What do you actually want?" Amalia stared blindly at the Rockies. The jagged peaks were terrifyingly sharp today, scoured clean by the freezing autumn air, the granite ridges slicing violently into the blue sky. "I want the terror to stop," she whispered. "Define the parameters of the terror." "I am terrified," she choked, forcing the words through a tight throat. "I am terrified of letting this become real, only to watch it vanish. I am terrified of him waking up in 6 months or 3 years and suffocating under the weight of it all. What happens when he realizes this life is too small, the domestic constraints are too heavy, and he desperately craves the freedom of the man who could simply pack a bag and conquer any city?" She ground her teeth together, her jaw aching with the tension. "He already calculated that his ambition outranked my presence. I understand the nuances now, I understand the cowardice behind the letter, but the empirical data remains on the record. He has a documented history of flight, and my children absolutely do not deserve to anchor their fragile little hearts to a man who has already proven his dreams are worth more than his staying power." This was the bleeding, undeniable core of the entire catastrophe. The stakes had fundamentally mutated. The battle was no longer merely about Amalia's bruised heart or William's redemption arc. It was entirely about Mia and Luca. They were 17 months old, utterly defenseless against the complex wreckage of their parents' history. They absorbed the world with wide, innocent, sage green eyes. Guided by pure, uncomplicated biological instinct, they were already reaching their tiny hands toward their father. Amalia was drowning in the impossible, agonizing paradox. How does a mother navigate the collision between her own terrifyingly resilient love for a man and her sacred blood-sworn duty to protect her children from that exact same love destroying them? There was no sterile legal framework for this. Any claim of a clean, simple resolution was a total delusion. She delivered the ultimatum that very evening. The residual, blinding fury had finally burned off, leaving behind a cold, diamond-hard clarity that was infinitely more intimidating. She confronted him in the living room. Luca sat wedged securely between them on the sofa, aggressively evaluating a cardboard picture book while Mia slept with absolute tyrannical authority in the nursery. "I require an answer to a question," she stated quietly, her eyes tracking the steady rise and fall of Luca's small chest. "And I need you to treat it as a binding contract." "All right," William agreed instantly. "What happens when the novelty wears off?" She turned her head, locking her dark eyes onto his. "I am not talking about the golden weekends. What happens when Luca hits a grueling developmental regression, or Mia spikes a fever for 2 straight weeks, or I am drowning in a massive trial that consumes every shred of my sanity? What happens when a massive infrastructure project demands your presence in another time zone? The children are crying for you, and I am completely unavailable?" She dug her fingernails into her own thigh to keep her hands from shaking. What happens when the crushing, suffocating reality of this life finally lands, and it costs you significantly more capital than you ever budgeted for? William did not offer an immediate, polished rebuttal. His restraint sent a wave of profound relief crashing through her. A rapid-fire defense would have been a cheap, rehearsed performance. He slowly shifted his gaze to Luca, who was currently tracing the bottom edge of a cardboard page with absolute monk-like devotion. He looked out toward the dark glass of the balcony and finally brought his eyes back to Amalia. "I have absolutely no idea," he admitted softly. Amalia blinked, momentarily destabilized by the raw honesty. "I cannot predict the exact logistical mechanics of those disasters," he continued, his voice a deep, steady rumble. "But I can clearly state my absolute intent. I have spent the last 3 weeks surgically dissecting my own cowardice. The defining truth is that I drafted that cowardly letter because I was paralyzed by fear. I wasn't afraid of you, or the relationship. I was terrified of becoming the selfish bastard who demanded you fundamentally alter your entire existence to serve my ambition. I aggressively convinced myself I was shielding you from an unfair request, when in reality, I was just desperately protecting my own ego from a potential rejection." He leaned closer, holding her gaze with a fierce, burning intensity. "I refuse to ever utilize that defense mechanism again. I am going to ask the question. I will lay the variables on the table, even when I am violently terrified of the answer. And if the answer requires an impossible sacrifice," she challenged, her pulse hammering in her throat. "Then we engineer a solution," he stated with absolute finality. "Not me operating in isolation, not you carrying the burden alone. We figure it out together." A heavy, charged silence settled over the sofa. "My children do not deserve to be abandoned," she whispered fiercely, a fierce, protective tear finally breaking free. "I know," he breathed, the words thick with shame and conviction. "And neither do you. Neither did you. I will never attempt to litigate that fact. It is an absolute truth. But I swear to you, Amalia, I will spend the remainder of my breathing life acutely aware of that damage, and I will structure every single choice I make around never repeating it." Luca paused his rigorous literary review. He slowly lifted his small head, turning his intense, evaluating gaze to William and then to Amalia. He offered a short, grunting sound of general approval and immediately returned his attention to the cardboard flaps. Amalia stared at William. She studied the face of the architect who had once callously redesigned her life without a permit. She was now looking at a man who was meticulously, desperately requesting permission to lay a single brick. "I require more time," she said, her voice finally softening. "I know. That is not a rejection. I know that too." She drove alone on Sunday. Heading west, the urban sprawl thinned out, surrendering to the slow, patient upward tilt of the Rocky Mountain foothills. She had left the twins in Cora's capable hands, a woman who swept through the front door radiating the exact, unquestioning authority required to feed 2 volatile toddlers an excellent lunch. The car offered a rare, sterile sanctuary. The apartment was suffocating, every corner heavily saturated with the phantom echoes of recent exhausting conversations. The leather steering wheel felt cold and grounding beneath her palms, the steady hum of the tires against the asphalt a hypnotic, steadying rhythm. She killed the radio after 10 minutes. The heavy, pressurized silence of the sealed cabin was infinitely more useful. She dissected the letter again. For 3 weeks, she had been scrutinizing it through a brand new, terrifying lens. She bypassed the familiar, protective armor of her rage, digging her bare hands into a much sharper, bloodier question. What had she actually desired the exact moment she read it? She had wanted him to turn around. During those agonizing first 48 hours, she had desperately willed her phone screen to illuminate with his name, praying he would confess to a catastrophic miscalculation. She had craved his return with the raw, bleeding desperation of a woman whose armor hadn't yet calcified. She had waited for that phantom phone call in total, humiliating secrecy for far longer than she would ever admit aloud. Eventually, the waiting bled dry. She constructed a new reality. It was a genuinely magnificent life, built on the solid bedrock of a thriving career, 2 perfect children, Cora's fierce loyalty, and a mother who projected unyielding Portuguese opinions through Sunday video calls. She had survived the cratering of her world without requiring a rescue team. Yet two violently opposing truths coexisted in her chest. She had built a triumphant empire, and she had never deleted his contact information. Both realities were equally valid. The brutal question she was driving toward, the unanswerable paradox demanding her attention, was how to navigate the agonizing reality that the architect of her greatest pain was also the man she still irrevocably loved. He was no longer the two-dimensional villain she had sketched to survive the darkest nights. He was a tangible, breathing man showing up at her door clutching grease-stained bags of banana muffins, butchering the cadence of toddler books, and stubbornly anchoring himself to her living room when she offered him every conceivable exit. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the sternum. Releasing him from his eternal sentence might actually be the only way to free herself. She killed the engine at the gravel edge of a trailhead she had absolutely zero intention of hiking. The foothills loomed over the windshield, ancient and indifferent, utterly unconcerned with human timelines. The crisp, pine-scented air leaked through the vents as she pictured Mia. Yesterday, her daughter had ruthlessly dragged William across the living room, presenting random domestic artifacts for his formal inspection: a wooden block, a plastic spoon, the brittle, drying burgundy dahlias. Mia executed the tour with the brisk, demanding efficiency of a corporate auditor, and William had received each mundane object with breathless, reverent attention. She pictured Luca, who had bypassed evaluation entirely, crawling directly into William's lap and collapsing into a heavy sleep, his tiny fists permanently locked into the coarse cotton of William's shirt, like a sailor clinging to a newly discovered continent. She knew Cora would demand an update tonight. Cora would absorb the verdict, offering a knowing smirk that clearly communicated she had been predicting this exact timeline for weeks. Her mind drifted back to the jagged edge of his goodbye letter. "I think if I stay, I'll spend the rest of my life watching myself turn into someone who resents the choice." For 2 years, that specific sentence had acted as an accelerant for her fury. Now, she finally understood the pure, suffocating terror beneath the ink. It was the frantic panic of a man who fundamentally distrusted his own capacity to survive inside a massive love. A coward who preemptively detonated the bridge because the vulnerability of being asked to stay was simply too heavy to carry. She possessed her own mirrored version of that exact same terror. It thrummed in her own veins, a matching, terrifying genetic flaw. True forgiveness requires a brutal accounting of the wound. It is the agonizing, conscious decision to stop allowing the trauma to dictate every future movement. She was actively bleeding from the history, and she refused to pretend the scar tissue didn't pull when she moved. But she was officially finished letting the ghost of his departure sit at the head of her table. She threw the SUV into reverse. He was sitting on the sofa when she unlocked the door. Cora had vanished. The twins were submerged in their heavy post-lunch comas. Mia occupied the portable crib, while Luca remained heavily slumped against William's ribcage, his small hand still fiercely clutching the sleeve of his jacket. William snapped his head up as the deadbolt clicked. He completely refrained from interrogating her absence. She dropped her keys onto the entry table with a sharp, metallic clatter. She stared at the man who had abandoned his professional script, instinctively understanding that simply holding his ground was the only argument that mattered. "I am not going to stand here and pretend the anger has evaporated," she stated softly. "I know. It burns hotter on certain days. It might take years to fully bleed out. It might never completely vanish. That is entirely fair. And I require a fundamental shift in your architecture." She held his gaze, her eyes burning with a fierce, protective heat. "I need you to vocalize the terror before you unilaterally execute a demolition. I need you to ask the question, even when you are paralyzed by my potential answer." "Yes," he vowed. It lacked any theatrical flourish. It was simply a binding oath. "And this," she gestured vaguely at the apartment, the sleeping toddlers, the impossible heavy gravity of the three of them occupying the same oxygen. "This process will be excruciatingly slow. There will be brutally difficult days. I am not handing you a neatly tied ending. I am offering you a very fragile beginning." He nodded slowly, his chest rising in a deep, unsteady breath. "A beginning is all I want." She sank into the armchair opposite the sofa. Luca shifted slightly against William's side, exhaled a long, milky breath, and settled deeper into his sleep. Mia Claire, she whispered into the quiet room. Luca James. He had read the names on the birth certificates, but she delivered them differently now. It was a formal surrender of the gates. These are my children. These are yours. I am letting you inside. William dragged his eyes from Luca's sleeping face to the mesh edges of Mia's crib. He repeated the syllables like a sacred incantation. Mia Claire, he rasped, the sound barely scraping past his throat. Luca James. The final consonant shattered completely. A single heavy tear broke loose, tracking silently into his beard. He made absolutely no effort to wipe it away. Amalia looked at the devastating fracture in his composure. She stared at the man who had once engineered a massive failure, who was now painstakingly laying bricks to build something capable of holding them all. A chaotic, suffocating cocktail of rage, profound love, paralyzing fear, and blinding hope flared simultaneously in her chest. It was a volatile mixture they would likely breathe for years to come. She suspended her hand over the empty carpet, bridging exactly half the distance between the armchair and the sofa. An opening, a monumental, terrifying question. William stared at her trembling fingers. He lifted his eyes to meet hers. He reached back. The rough calluses of his large hand brushed against her knuckles. He gently laced his fingers through hers, the heat of his skin instantly shocking her pulse. It offered zero guarantees of a clean resolution. It was simply a beginning. April in Denver carried a vastly different frequency than October. The biting, high-altitude chill still clung to the early morning shadows, but a restless, vibrant green energy hummed beneath the thawing soil. Along the asphalt paths of Washington Park, the towering cottonwoods were pushing out their first tentative buds, unfurling delicate leaves against the warming sky. It was the exact same park. The lake still caught the brilliant morning light. The path still rolled smoothly beneath the heavy stroller wheels. Yet the entire gravitational configuration of the scene had been completely rewritten. Amalia steered the stroller. William walked a comfortable arm's length beside her, the steam from his black coffee curling into the crisp air. His face carried the profound, settled peace of a man who had redefined his existence and fiercely protected that new reality. 3 months ago, he had signed the lease on a modest, scaled-down apartment in Cherry Creek. It was a highly deliberate geographical calculation, within easy walking distance of the twins, yet maintaining enough physical distance to prove he was painstakingly earning his proximity rather than assuming it. Mia rode in the stroller, a containment strategy she tolerated with rapidly deteriorating patience. At 14 months old, she firmly believed walking was the only acceptable mode of transit for a woman of her independence. She communicated this manifesto by jabbing a rigid index finger toward the pavement and demanding down with absolute, tyrannical conviction. Luca, however, had already secured his freedom. His tiny, pudgy hand was entirely swallowed by William's large grip as he navigated the path at a grueling, methodical pace, utterly captivated by every single microscopic crack and pebble in the asphalt. "He is going to secure another rock," Amalia observed, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "He acquires a new specimen on every single expedition," William agreed. "He doesn't just acquire them, he hoards them." "I currently have 4 distinct rocks arranged on my kitchen island," William noted. He explicitly delivered them on Tuesday. "He is curating a highly exclusive gallery. I have been strictly briefed on which ones are the premium selections." William glanced down at his son, who had currently halted all forward momentum to deeply inspect a gray fleck in the concrete. Apparently, every rock he touches is premium. The reality of rebuilding a shattered foundation rarely resembles a cinematic climax. It lacks soaring violins and dramatic airport reconciliations. Instead, survival looked exactly like this: 2 lukewarm coffees, a stubborn double stroller, and a toddler hoarding gravel. It manifested as the slow, unremarkable migration of William's belongings onto her kitchen counter. The quiet, domestic evidence of a man finally anchoring himself to a space. It was grueling, unglamorous, daily labor. It meant navigating mornings that felt overwhelmingly heavy for absolutely no quantifiable reason, and enforcing the exhausting discipline of communicating fears before they metastasized into resentment. When William recently texted, "The Arts Council needs me to present in Boston next month. Can we sit down and discuss the logistics?" Amalia's initial reflex had been a spike of blinding panic, but the panic had quickly dissolved. He had actively asked. That single, terrifying question fundamentally altered the entire load-bearing structure of their relationship. The damage wasn't magically erased. The architecture was simply, painstakingly, still in progress. Mia finally escalated her containment protest to a loud, sustained vocal objection. She only agreed to a temporary ceasefire when William reached into his wool coat and produced a smooth, flat stone, a premium piece, heavily vetted and borrowed from Luca's private collection. He offered it to his daughter. Mia grabbed it, aggressively evaluated its texture, and grudgingly accepted the bribe. "Excellent diplomatic de-escalation," Amalia murmured. "I am actively studying the local politics." She studied his profile from the corner of her eye. Over the past 6 grueling months, this architect had meticulously learned the exact cadence of Mia's favorite lullabies. He had memorized the fact that Luca required exactly 5 minutes of total silence to decompress after leaving a chaotic environment. He had mastered the violent, complex mechanics of collapsing the double stroller with one hand. Most crucially, he had learned that Amalia required partnership, not management. He was doing the bleeding, heavy lifting, and he carried the bruises to prove it. She hadn't magically stopped being afraid. The phantom echoes of his betrayal still triggered occasional unpredictable flashes of white-hot anger, but they had survived 3 agonizing, tear-soaked arguments that had left them both totally hollowed out for hours, only to wake up the next morning and realize the foundation had held. The structure hadn't cracked. It had simply settled deeper into the earth. Forgiveness was the most terrifying hazard she had ever navigated. It wasn't born from naive amnesia or a weak surrender. It was the brutal, conscious decision to acknowledge that the man standing beside her today was fundamentally different from the coward who had fled 2 years ago. She was consciously choosing to lower her weapons, not because her terror had miraculously vanished, but because she had stared directly into the abyss of that fear, and determined that the love simply weighed more. Luca successfully excavated his prize. It was a thoroughly unremarkable chunk of gray aggregate, slightly flat, catching the harsh morning light on one jagged edge. He hoisted it above his head with both hands, offering it up for William's official structural inspection. William immediately dropped into a deep crouch. He scrutinized the pebble with absolute, unfeigned reverence. "That is a structurally perfect specimen," he confirmed. Luca issued a short, guttural grunt of deep satisfaction. He bypassed Amalia entirely and forcefully deposited the rock directly into the deep pocket of William's jacket. It was a secure deposit, a permanent safekeeping. William rose to his full height. Amalia was watching him. She wasn't glaring through the narrow slits of her old armor. Her posture was completely open, her dark eyes wide and terrifyingly clear. He held her gaze, his own eyes shining with a sudden, overwhelming heat. "Thank you," he whispered. She knew perfectly well he wasn't referring to the gravel. "Don't thank me," she replied, her voice thick but incredibly steady. "Just show up tomorrow." "Same time?" "Same time." The vibrant energy of the park blurred into a chaotic, beautiful background noise. The rippling water, the unfurling cottonwoods, the mundane miracle of a city waking up. A tiny, dirt-stained hand blindly reached up and wrapped around Amalia's index finger. Luca's transaction was complete. He was prepared to resume the expedition. She gripped his small hand tightly, and the 4 of them moved forward together. They walked at the agonizingly slow pace of a boy obsessed with every single fracture in the pavement, a speed that defied all logic and schedules, but was the exact perfect velocity for a Saturday morning with absolutely nowhere else to be.